By the end of 2025, we'll have 15 superhero TV shows and movies. Out of those, 9 are from Marvel and 5 are from DC. Only 2 can really be called independent. The Henry Danger movie, which continues the Nickelodeon series, and Invincible Season 3. Even though it's being made by a big evil company like Prime Video, the Invincible comic was originally published by an indie label. The author still has the final say on what happens in the adaptation. And Mark Grayson is the only one here who doesn't live in a shared universe. After Invincible broke the internet and beat Daredevil Born Again in popularity and fan reception, it's pretty clear that we need more projects like this. We need more adaptations of indie comics like Savage Dragon, Astro City, or Madman, because that's the only way to really save the superhero genre. And I'm gonna prove it to you. The big difference between indie superheroes and the ones owned by big corporations is that the indie ones usually have less marketing, smaller budgets, and aren't built on famous IPs. That might sound like a huge downside, because Invincible episodes are never gonna have the same budget as MCU shows like What If or Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man.
I'm poor and I hate it.
On top of that, fans have to spread the word themselves if they want people to watch. But the upside for us is that this forces creators to do things right. If Robert Kirkman's comic hadn't been good, nobody would have bought it. If the story wasn't well adapted into the show, nobody would have watched it. And if the characters weren't well written, nobody would buy the merch. Indie superhero stories have to be good, or else they just fade away. Spawn got over 300 issues because it handled drama really well, and had way more violence and brutality than anything from Marvel or DC. Invincible sold over 20,000 copies per issue because of its well-developed characters and wild plot twists. And the new Space Ghost series became one of the best-rated comics of the year thanks to its awesome retro style. That doesn't mean corporate superheroes like Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man don't have great stories. The reason they've been at the top for so many decades and became pop culture icons is because their stories hit home with fans around the world. But let's be honest, now that they're well established, these characters sell more because of their name than the quality of their stories. Zeb Wells' run on Spider-Man didn't go over well with fans, and he ended up leaving the project quietly. But Amazing Spider-Man still never dropped out of the top 20 best-selling comics each month. Hardcore Spidey fans will keep reading no matter how much the story makes them want to puke, just because they want to keep up with their favorite character. That's not how it works with indie comics. The writers of Invincible, Moon Man, or Radiant Black have to earn their readers every issue, or people just stop buying them. And if you think this only affects comics, think again. It's the same thing in animation and live action. One of the biggest criticisms Marvel got after the Infinity Saga is that they dropped a bunch of half-baked projects with questionable quality. They thought fans would eat up whatever they threw at them, just because they were hooked on this shared universe. That's why they started filming Born Again and Brave New World without even finishing the scripts. Kevin Feige realized during filming that those projects were a mess, and they had to throw a ton of money at fixing the story as they went. With Born Again, they kinda pulled it off, but it's super obvious that the reshot episodes, the first 2 and the last one, are the best ones in the show. It looked like they were gonna slow things down a bit when Bob Iger came back as Disney's CEO, but they're still making the same mistakes.
Is that so?
Filming for Doomsday started before the Russo brothers even finished the script. Don't get me wrong, I honestly hope this turns out to be the best crossover in movie history. The hype's pretty high after Deadpool and Wolverine, and Marvel got everyone hyped just by showing a live stream with some empty chairs. But they're still rushing things. They're betting that people will show up just for the actors and nostalgia, not because the story or script is actually good. They're making the same mistake they made with the comics. But that's not the case with Invincible or The Boys, which have to be good, no matter what. Their biggest promo tool is word of mouth. People telling their friends they have to check out these shows because they're amazing. If the audience doesn't think they're top tier, then no one's gonna watch them. And that's actually great news for us. Indie hero stories are way more based on merit. If they suck, like the last live-action Hellboy movies or the Bloodshot adaptation, nobody's gonna watch them. That means any studio taking a chance on an indie story is gonna try to do something bold with these new characters. The Boys isn't just more violent and sexual than anything Marvel or DC has done. It also gave the genre a new spin, asking what would happen if the most powerful superheroes were created by an evil company instead of coming from another planet or getting their powers in a freaky accident. The Seven aren't truth and justice heroes like the Avengers or the Justice League. They're messed up pervs being used as political propaganda. We hadn't seen those kinds of themes in live action since the Watchmen movie adaptation in 2009. For a whole decade, that perspective was basically missing. And even in Snyder's Watchmen, the impact of media on society wasn't explored the way it is in every season of The Boys. This show broke the mold, and the same thing could happen with other indie hero adaptations. An animated Madman show would blow people's minds. Mike Allred's comic is about a killer who gets brought back to life by two mad scientists, but he doesn't remember anything from his past. As he searches for his place in the universe, the guy decides to become a superhero. This is a totally wild comic that mixes sci-fi, romance, and pulp. I say it has to be animated because there's just no way to recreate Allred's visual style in live action, no matter the budget. Something like this would be completely different from anything we've seen in the genre, and there's no way Marvel or DC would ever go for a project this weird. Only an indie show could pull something like that off.
I mean, like, crazy!
Now that superheroes are mainstream and even people who've never read a comic know the usual tropes, we can see adaptations that challenge the core ideas of superhero stories, like Astro City. In this comic by Kurt Busiek, we see what it'd be like to live in a world full of superheroes, but not just from the meta-human's perspective. There are full issues that focus on regular people, like reporters or a man with no powers at all who remembers a former love from an alternate timeline. You'd never see stories like that in Marvel or DC, but Astro City could totally work as a live-action series with a pretty episodic format. And if what we really need is a full-on deconstruction of the superhero genre, there's Black Hammer by Jeff Lemire. The story's about a group of heroes who get stuck on another planet after a big cosmic battle. But the weird part is, they can't go back home. They're trapped in a small rural town and have to figure out how to live there. Lemire puts the spotlight on character development, blending classic superhero stuff with horror, mystery, and slice of life. I'm not sure if this comic could really work in live action with a limited budget, because it's got some wild moments that would need solid visual effects to keep things believable. But if Invincible was a hit on Prime Video with just okay-ish animation, Black Hammer could totally work as an animated series too. I'm sure people would love it. And I know what you're thinking. Nobody's stopping Marvel or DC from telling completely new stories or flipping the superhero genre on its head. It's already tough enough for an indie hero like Invincible to beat the big Marvel and DC titles in TV ratings. But the ones really pushing the genre forward with bold, fresh stories are usually the indies. They're the ones who have to do something different to stand out. I'm glad Superman and the Fantastic Four are going back to a more classic tone, bringing back the hopeful vibe from the old days. But it's not enough for Marvel and DC to just battle over who sells more tickets. These studios tend to recycle the same stories over and over and over, because once a formula works, they just want to milk it forever. It's no coincidence that Sony wants to go multiverse again with Spider-Man 4 after No Way Home made $1.9 billion. They're trying to tell the same story again because they know it sells. But the indies don't play that game. Indie stories push Marvel and DC to step up. Since they have to be good, and often dive into topics that would freak out a Marvel or DC exec, the indie stuff keeps raising the bar. They force the big guys to take more risks with their themes, their style, and the way they tell stories.
I don't get it.
Think about this. If it weren't for the success of Invincible and The Boys as TV shows, Marvel never would have bet on high-budget series for Disney+. Proof of that is, up until 2021, they'd only supported low-budget stuff like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or Daredevil. I know Daredevil's awesome, but the showrunners straight up said they had to juggle a tiny little budget because Marvel and Netflix weren't sure the show would even work. But now, Disney's being forced to spend way more money, so indie heroes don't take the whole pie. Same thing happened with DC. For decades, they were making low-budget shows on CW, but now they're dropping over $100 million on The Penguin. That would have never happened before, because the big studios were all about box office cash. They used to focus only on their theatrical projects. Sure, the streaming war has something to do with it, but if indie superhero shows weren't making waves, Marvel and DC wouldn't be scrambling to flood the platforms with their own series. And if that's still not enough to convince you, remember this. Adaptations of indie superhero stories usually stay pretty true to the source material because the original creator is directly involved in the creative process. Invincible is the best example. It's one of the most faithful adaptations out there. Of course, there were a few tweaks to make it work for TV, but Kirkman made sure it kept the soul of the comic he wrote. Most of the key lines and big events are lifted straight from the pages, and every single change was made to improve the story, not mess it up just for the heck of it, like you see in some other adaptations.
Prove it.
In issue 63, Eve barely lasts 4 panels in the fight against Conquest. She can't even slow him down. He takes her out without breaking a sweat. Kirkman wrote it that way so we'd think Eve was dead, which would push Mark to go all out in the final part of the battle. But in the show, Eve holds her ground for a full 4 minutes. She throws up shields, messes with the air's density to slow Conquest down, and uses armor to absorb hits and punch harder. She actually goes toe-to-toe with Conquest. And for a moment, it even looks like she might beat him without Mark's help. In the end, the Viltrumite still wins, because Eve can't keep up the pace, and the outcome stays the same as in the comics. But the changes in the show give us a longer, more exciting fight. Plus, it shows that Eve's one of the most powerful characters in this universe, even before the power-up we see later. It's not a huge change, but the show improved the comic because the creator was involved. That doesn't happen with Marvel and DC. Most of the original creators passed away years ago, since these characters are super old. Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, and Bill Finger are all gone, so they can't oversee the adaptations of the heroes they created. But Marvel and DC could talk to the writers, who are actually working on these characters right now. Jonathan Hickman wrote the 2015 Secret Wars, which was a huge hit. The MCU is going to base the biggest crossover in movie history on that comic. But Hickman didn't even get a text to ask what he thought about the idea, even though they're using his story for the live action. I'm not saying Feige has to hire Hickman to write the script for Secret Wars. Comics and movies are completely different worlds, and maybe Hickman doesn't even want to write a Hollywood blockbuster. But it's wild that the guy who wrote the comic isn't even being consulted by the Russo brothers. That would be like if Robert Kirkman had absolutely nothing to do with the Invincible adaptation. DC's got a slightly different strategy. Jeff Johns created Stargirl and was executive producer on her show. And one of the co-creators of Lanterns is Tom King, a writer known for his pretty controversial comics at DC. The problem is, Stargirl got buried on CW, and Tom King has never written a Green Lantern comic. It'd be a whole different story if they'd asked Johns to do the series, because he literally reinvented the character. He wrote the best Green Lantern run ever. But Tom King's involvement in Lanterns feels more like a move to help him break into TV and make some extra cash. It's not really about giving comic writers creative control to keep the adaptations true to the source. In fact, looking at King's track record, I'm kind of worried about him being in charge of Lanterns. I'm seriously scared for Hal Jordan. But I'm not going to pretend everything's black and white either. Having the original writer on board doesn't guarantee things will turn out great. Gerard Way wrote all of the Umbrella Academy comics and was also involved in the show, but the adaptation still ended up being a turd and straying far from the comics. On the flip side, Garth Ennis, who wrote the Boys comic, had nothing to do with the Prime Video show. And still, the show ended up being way better than the comic, even without him being involved. But you gotta keep in mind that Ennis was never really trying to tell some great story that broke all the rules. The comic is packed with satire, but also with a lot of cruelty and over-the-top violence just for the sake of it. The Prime Video show actually did a better job here. It kept the comic's crazy violence, but gave way more depth to each of the characters. It's one of those rare times where straying from the original material actually worked out. But that's mainly because the comic wasn't exactly a masterpiece. There's a much better chance of the adaptation being good when the creator is involved. I'm not the biggest fan of Todd McFarlane's writing, but I do trust he'll give it his all on the Spawn live action he's been working on for years. If Spawn belonged to some big company instead of its original creator, they probably would have already made a live action version that totally ditched the comics and made it a family-friendly flick. They'd tone down the violence and just tell whatever story they wanted. But McFarlane knows he can't throw $50 million into a blockbuster unless he's sure it'll pay off, so he's not rushing anything. Like I said earlier, the only way a Spawn movie's gonna succeed is if it's actually good. Otherwise, it'll end up like the 90s version, which was terrible and barely anyone watched. If we want the superhero genre to stay fresh and exciting for years to come, we need a whole lot more indie productions. But if that's not in the cards, at least we're getting plenty more Invincible in the next few years. Season 4 is going to be the most epic one yet. We break down how it's going to blow our minds in this video over here.
Spoiler alert.